Hi everyone, welcome to A Reformed Catholic, and on this channel we explore all things theology, philosophy, ecumenism, and apologetics. And if you've been enjoying the content so far, please hit like and subscribe. That would mean a lot to this little channel. Well, in this video, we'll explore a foundational theological doctrine. This is the doctrine of the image of God, the Imago Dei. This concept seeks to define what it means to be human, to be created by God in his likeness, and how this informs our understanding of our identity, purpose, and who we are. This is a really, really important topic, and I think there's at least two reasons why you should care about the image of God. The first is because we need to get this right, because the idea of the image of God historically has been foundational to Western civilization. The reason we have equality in most Western countries, the reason that we have um, dignity and worth for who you are, whether you're from um, a particular country or from a particular creed or from a particular religion, the reason that all of us have equality, at least in terms of the law, is because of this foundational idea of the image of God that has shaped Western civilization. It's a crucial concept, not just theologically, but it has implications and has had implications historically for the shaping of our society globally. Secondly, I think the idea of the image of God has been neglected, especially by the evangelical movement. I think when you hear about the gospel, often what people will start with is the fact that we are sinners and we deserve death and we deserve punishment, and Jesus has died on our behalf and he set us free. But I think if you start with you're a sinner, that actually fails to account for the fact that we are actually valuable, that God intended a particular purpose for us when he created us, that ultimately the sin that we have that has corrupted our bodies and our minds and our souls is not the ultimate reality. It is true that we are corrupted, but foundationally who we are the image of God. We are created to reflect him, to be in his likeness. That has been corrupted, but that hasn't disappeared altogether. So I think it's really important for us to start with the image of God, especially when we talk about what the gospel is, because if you don't start with the image of God, you start with a very pessimistic anthropology where basically you start to think you're worth nothing. Whereas what scripture says is that although our corruption has separated us from God, we are actually valuable in God's eyes. In fact, that's the reason that Christ came to die for us, even though he didn't have to. Well, in this particular video, I want to examine three historical interpretations of the Imago Dei. And these three views can be summarized as substantive, relational, and functional views. There's lots of other views out there, and I think broadly, I feel very comfortable to summarize them into these three perspectives. And each of these have strengths and weaknesses. Each of them have various trade-offs philosophically. And then ultimately, at the end of this video, I want to turn to the Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck, who I think offers the best explanation of the Imago Dei because he integrates all these three views together and provides a pretty comprehensive approach to work out what the image of God actually means. Okay, let's start with the substantive view. The substantive view asserts that the Imago Dei is an intrinsic attribute of human nature, an ontological reality embedded within humans. And basically, this draws from the theology of Thomas Aquinas, and this perspective locates the image of God in the rational soul or intellect, positing a structural likeness to God's essence. And Aquinas maintained that this resemblance is so fundamental that even angels, as purely spiritual beings, more perfectly reflect God's image than we do, which is a strange thing to say, but I think when I give you an illustration and sort of talk about where Thomas is coming from, it will make sense. The illustration is, imagine a precious jewel, um, and it's a jewel that's being sold, right? Now, the reason that this jewel is expensive, the reason that this jewel is sought after, is not merely because of its cut or utility, what it's going to be used for. Rather, it has some intrinsic value based on its substance. It might be made from gold or diamonds or whatever it might be. So that's kind of like the substantive view, where human beings bear God's image through their very essence, irrespective of external factors. So in the same way, we have certain qualities that mirror who God is. So for example, the qualities of reason and intelligence. We somehow resemble God in a way that's exceptional, in a way that other animals and creatures don't even come close. We have a sense of morality and justice, which God has, albeit at a much higher degree that a lot of animals arguably don't have. So there are certain qualities that are inherent to who we are in our substance that resemble God. Now, the strength of this approach is that it's very good at upholding human dignity, affirming that every individual possesses inherent worth and virtue by the fact that they're created in God's image. It provides a very stable basis for ethical considerations of human value. So whether you've got two hands or one hand, whether you're old or young, whether you speak English or Mandarin, ultimately because you have the likeness of God in who you are, in your substance, in your essence, you are ultimately um, uh, esteemed as God's image and esteemed as equal among all other humans. But this view actually has a fundamental weakness as well, because it actually neglects some of the relational and functional aspects of God's image that I think Scripture speaks about. It risks presenting the image as a fixed quality rather than a lived out reality. So the question is, if the image of God is just a substance, it's just certain qualities of God that we have, then how do we live that out? How do we reflect it in the real world? Are we just going to say that this only applies to who we are, or are we going to say that the image of God is also what we do and how we behave and how we act? So I think the substantive view has a lot of merit because it is very good at upholding the equality of all human beings, human dignity, human value, but it has some weaknesses regarding what to do with it. The second view is what is called the relational view. And the relational view is I think, fairly modern compared to the other views. It was clearly articulated by neo-Orthodox theologians such as Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, who posit that the imago Dei is realized through relationships with God and with others. Now, Barth's concept of the analogia relationis underscores human sociality as well as human gender as being reflections of the Trinitarian communion with God Himself. So the fact that we are created in community, the fact that we relate to each other is a reflection of who God is in Himself as the triune God. So in that sense, we are made in the image of God. And as I said, Barth extends this out to social dynamics, but also gender dynamics as well. An illustration of this is, consider like a tapestry where individual threads gain meaning through their interwoven connections, right? So individually, those threads don't have any meaning, but when you interweave them together, there is rich meaning that is brought about as an emergent property. Similarly, this view holds that humans mirror God's image in the context of community and relational bonds. The strength of this particular view is that it places relationships at its center rather than the individual dimension. And I think you can kind of see that in Scripture as well. Barth's very good at sort of integrating biblical themes of covenant and the relational nature of God with His people, Israel, and the church, to show that, to a large extent, the image of God ultimately is a relational concept rather than an individualist or a substantive concept. So it really underscores the communal aspect of human existence. But the weakness, I think, is by prioritizing relationality, it may undervalue the individual dimension of the Imago Dei. An overemphasis on community could obscure the personal accountability and identity that we as human beings have towards God. Just because you're not married or just because you don't have a family doesn't mean you're not reflecting God, right? Because at the end of the day, there is something to that substantive view that I talked about earlier, where individually we're all made in the image of God. The third view is called the functional view. The functional view has been advanced by scholars like J. Richard Middleton, who equates the Imago Dei with humanity's divinely appointed role. We are meant to be vice regents of God, exercising dominion over creation. It is really grounded in the text of Genesis 1:26 to 28, where God actually tells humans to subdue the world. And this interpretation sees humans as God's representatives, tasked with stewarding the earth and filling the earth and basically bringing God's dominion to the earth. So it really focuses on on the human vocation rather than the human essence, as the substantive view does. An illustration of this is you can kind of imagine a delegate entrusted with governing a territory on behalf of a king. So that's kind of like what the functional view is positing. We are vice regents who reflect God, who is king overall. And by fulfilling the mandate to care for and cultivate creation, we're actually bringing God's rule and reign to this world. This view has a very clear purpose for humanity, which is its ultimate strength. It aligns with the biblical creation narrative. It has strong support in Genesis. It highlights the active role of humans in God bringing about order from chaos. But the weakness to this particular view is that it might seem to reduce the Imago Dei to a utilitarian concept or like a functional concept, potentially overlooking the inherent worth and relation aspects of humanity. It risks painting humans as solely being valuable based on what they do rather than who they are fundamentally. So, for example, if you're a young child or if you're disabled, you cannot perhaps exercise your function to subdue the world as well as someone who's more able-bodied or someone who is a bit older and more mature. Does that mean that you are any less the image of God? The answer is probably no. But I think this view succumbs to that weakness in the sense that it risks defining the image of God based on what you do rather than who you are. So now that I've quickly gone through these three views, I think it's probably time to turn to Herman Bavinck, who I think offers the best explanation of what the image of God is, and particularly from a Reformed tradition perspective. Herman Bavinck's understanding of the Imago Dei stands out for its integrative approach. It synthesizes the strengths of all the views I've mentioned while actually trying to mitigate their shortcomings. He actually contends that the image of God encompasses the entirety of the human person, body, soul, and faculties, offering a comprehensive vision of humanity's divine reflection. So we don't just have the image of God, but we are the image of God, right? So we just don't have aspects of who God is, whether it be in his substance, in his relationships, or even in terms of what he does in the world. We are the image of God. Bavinck basically argues that we are small g gods. And this might sound surprising to you because this is something you would hear from Eastern Orthodox theologians who talk about theosis. But in the Reformed tradition, there is a strong sense in which we are, in some way, a direct reflection of God in who he is, what he does, and in his relationships. So we can't separate or take certain aspects of our likeness. It's all of it. And the way Bavinck does this is he employs the archetype-ectype distinction to frame his theology. So what does this mean? And this sounds like big words, but it's really quite simple. Basically, Bavinck argues that God is the archetype. He's the perfect original, while humans are the ectype, a created reflection. He insists that the Imago Dei is not confined to a single faculty, but actually pervades the whole person, rejecting any sort of dualistic separation of body and soul, which perhaps Aquinas succumbs to. An illustration of this is where, for example, if you picture a portrait that captures the full likeness of who you are, that portrait in its entirety reflects you. It's not just the paint, it's not just the canvas, it's not just that particular portrait amongst other portraits. So it's not just the substance, it's not just the function, it's not just the relationships, but in its entirety, it is a microcosm of who you are. In Bavinck's view, every aspect of humanity reflects God's image in a unified manner. And this view is really good because it avoids reductionism, it affirms the dignity of the entire person, It incorporates the fact that we are created to reign and rule as God's vice regents. It incorporates the fact that we reflect God's triune relationships. So in its entirety, we are reflecting God in every single way. And Bavinck here does a lot of work to criticize the substantive view particularly, but especially in the Thomistic articulation for its dualistic tendencies, as I mentioned before, because Thomas actually elevates the soul above the body because of his Neoplatonic influence. He also rejects the Roman Catholic notion of donum super additum, the idea that the original righteousness was a detachable gift lost at the fall, arguing instead that the imago Dei is inseparable from the human nature, corrupted yet not eradicated by sin. To put it another way, Bavinck criticizes the Roman Catholic doctrine of donum super additum, where the imago Dei is tantamount to a positive moral standing before God. In other words, under Rome's view, Adam's original righteousness is a superadded gift, and the corruption of the imago Dei reverts humanity back to its natural, ethically neutral condition. But Bavinck disagrees with this. Bavinck basically says the imago Dei doesn't have to do with our righteousness per se, as Aquinas would argue, but it actually concerns our whole human being as a whole, a substance, every part of it, and that includes the body as well as the soul. And for Bavinck, the question is not whether our righteousness is lost when the image of God is corrupted. It's the fact that we, having the image of God, is not necessarily connected to righteousness per se, but nevertheless, our image persists despite being corrupted. And also, I think it's important to note here that Bavinck grounds the continuation of the image, despite the fall, based on his theology of common grace. So common grace, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is God's sustaining mercy enabling humans to retain traces of relationality, rationality, and morality despite sin's pervasive effects. So despite the fact that we have sinned, we still have sunshine, we still enjoy our families, enjoy the good gifts of God, and the source is God's common grace, which is applicable for all human beings. And Bavinck argues that the reason that we still have the image of God, the reason that we haven't lost it completely, is because God's common grace is sustaining it. Yes, it's been corrupted, but nevertheless, we haven't completely lost it because of God's common grace. And I think all of this is really, really important because what Bavinck is doing is he's giving us a maximalist approach to the image of God. We cannot reduce the image of God to just one thing. We entirely, in our body, our soul, our spirit, we fully reflect who God is. That might be hard to sort of completely pass out or see direct connections, but I think ultimately Bavinck's method is let's not pick and choose how we reflect God. Let's remember that we resemble God fully, and that's why we are small g gods to a certain extent. And at some point, I'll probably do another video outlining how this coalesces really well with the Eastern Orthodox view of theosis. But for the moment, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful week. Thank you.